All right, this video will be looking at energy flow through ecosystems, part 8.2 of Unit 8, Ecology, AP Biology. Moving on, we're going to be dealing primarily with energy flow, this idea that energy flows through the ecosystem originating in the sun or with the sun and then making its way to all of the living things in that ecosystem through means of either capturing that energy, producing food, or eating that food from eating other organisms in order to obtain that food. There are several factors that are going to be important in dealing with energy flow, and one of those is temperature regulation. There are generally two groups of animals associated with temperature regulation. There are endotherms. Endotherms generate heat or generate energy through metabolism, and they maintain their body temperature through their metabolism by changing heart rate, storing fat, muscle contractions, different sorts of things. So it's a function of homeostasis. Whereas ectotherms rely on their behaviors in order to regulate body temperature. In other words, they have to change their location, change what they're doing in order to get warmer or get colder, depending on their needs. And a little bit more on this as well. Organisms, the relationship between body mass and metabolic rate is typically a direct relationship. Metabolic rate is basically the amount of energy expended by an animal over a given amount of time. And so a larger organism is going to have the ability to generate more heat and so needs to keep their metabolic rate down in order to not overheat, whereas smaller organisms are going to lose heat faster and so need to keep their metabolic rate up in order to generate heat. Like a bird or small bird constantly has to eat in order to stay warm, whereas a large animal is going to sleep most of the time in order to keep their metabolic rates low so that they don't overheat. A net gain in energy can oftentimes result in storage of fat, and a net loss in energy can be a reduction of mass and can actually lead to death. And so the balance here is very important as organisms are not only regulating body temperature, but are also regulating mass through their metabolic rate. And this leads to how organisms reproduce. This energy availability leads to different reproductive strategies. Some organisms produce a lot of offspring all at one time. This is less energy efficient because it's producing a big amount of offspring, like a sea turtle, salmon. There are several plants that this would be an example of. It's less efficient. However, the environments that they live in are typically also less stable. And so more offspring allows for a higher chance of some of those offspring surviving to the next generation. More offspring typically has less parental involvement as well. And so the sea turtle will lay several hundred eggs and then leave. And if 5 of them make it to adulthood, that's a pretty good percentage. Whereas the bears there on the right, they have a different strategy. They have fewer offspring, um, and they invest a lot of time and energy into those offspring in order to keep them alive. This is typically more energy efficient over the long run, and you will see this more common in more stable ecological environments because, well, there's less the bears have to adapt to, or any animal that uses this particular reproductive strategy. Changes in energy availability will affect population size also, which makes sense. If there's less energy, there's going to be less population. And typically, towards the top of the food chain, which we're getting ready to talk about, there's less energy, so you would expect that there's less population. At the bottom of the food chain, where there's more energy, there's a lot more population. And as you go up the pyramid, there's less and less population. Um, the changes that occur at the producer level which is at the bottom, can affect the size of the other trophic levels. And so these little levels are called trophic levels, which is basically like a feeding level. So you have producers that have the most energy, and then you have primary, secondary, tertiary consumers that are going to have decreasing amounts of energy. The general rule is there's approximately 10% of the energy available from one generation or from one trophic level to the next trophic level. So a little bit about food chains, talking about that. Food chains just show the direction of nutrient exchange and energy exchange from one organism to another. Each organism occupies a different trophic level, and you can see those trophic levels there. This actually has a fourth level to it, and so you won't often see the fourth level because, again, there's less energy available to each successive level, and so the owl occupying the top level, or this apex predator position, there's going to be very few owls in comparison to, say, grasshoppers, which is at the very bottom. And so the owl has to eat lots of snakes and birds in order to stay alive. A food web shows a better picture of an entire community because it shows all the relationships, not just a single string of them, but all the possible relationships in the ecosystem. It shows you all of that energy transfer. And again, energy transfer from one trophic level to the next tends to only be about 10%, or you would say 10% efficiency is about the highest you could get. And anything more than that is considered extremely efficient. Anything a lot less than that is going to be very inefficient. And energy inefficiency is what limits the food chain. Populations decrease the higher you get up the food chain, and so organisms are constantly trying to retain efficiency by regulating metabolic rate, body temperature, and all those things in order to get the most out of their food, which is this next point, just talking about more general scope of ideas. The activities of autotrophs and heterotrophs enable energy flow within an ecosystem. Autotrophs are, auto means self, troph feeding, and so these are self-feeding organisms. And so their ability to take in energy from the sun is going to directly affect the ecosystem. Some ecosystems don't have the sun available to them, and so rather than using photosynthesis, they will do a process called chemosynthesis, where they use inorganic molecules from the surrounding area in order to make glucose. But it's the same idea. They're still considered producers, these heterotrophs. Or these autotrophs, and heterotrophs have to consume other organisms, and so they depend on the amount of energy available in the autotrophs or in the lower heterotroph, and they also have to get matter from them. And so all of their carbon, in order to build their organic molecules, has to come from those. And so not only are they receiving energy from the previous trophic levels, but also building mass from them as well. So one of the strategies in order to increase reproductive efficiency has to do with seasonal reproduction. This happens not only in animals, but also in plants. A great example of plants doing this, plants produce pollen one time of the year. And the reason they produce pollen at certain times is because that particular time is best for that plant. When trees are making new leaves, that is when they are going, the sun is at the best angle in the spring and in the summer for production of food and production of seeds. And so that's when they're going to do that. But when the days decrease and the temperatures decrease, they're going to lose all of that. And that's so their reproducing has to do with the seasons. Animals are the same way. Animals will reproduce when the most food is available in order to maximize the chance of success. With that, there's different kinds of strategies out there depending on the length, gestational period or whatever it goes on for the particular type of animal. And some animals are able to reproduce multiple times a year. Some animals reproduce all at once, like we talked about earlier. And so a lot of that depends on parental strategies and availability of food and other resources.